Most people genuinely believed this entire story had already come to an end back in February 2022. The Antonov An-225 Maria, the single heaviest aircraft ever constructed. D, a machine so physically massive that its cargo hold alone stretched longer than the E. Entire distance covered by the Wright brothers' very first powered flight was destroyed at Hostomel Airport just outside Kiev. Rebuilding something on that scale seemed like a genuine impossibility to nearly everyone watching the news unfold. The original aircraft had required factories scattered across the entire Soviet Union just to produce it in the first place. Those exact same factories now sit divided across separate sovereign nations. Some of them have stopped existing entirely. Every major aviation analyst offering commentary at the time said essentially the same thing. Write it off completely. It's finished. But it turns out they were wrong about that. And this is genuinely how the An-225 Maria is actually being brought back to life right now, in a way that caught almost everyone off guard. Let's walk through the full story properly. On February 24th, 2022, Russian forces launched their full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Hostomel Airport, the operational home base of the An-225, instantly turned into an active war zone. The hangar sheltering the aircraft caught fire amid the fighting. Once the smoke finally cleared, all that remained was a burned, hollowed-out skeleton. The nose section had taken a direct artillery hit and was destroyed. The wings suffered serious damage. 3 out of the aircraft's original 6 engines were completely gone. At the absolute height of its career, this single aircraft had set and held more than 100 separate world records. It regularly transported cargo loads most people simply assumed could never be flown at all: 130-ton industrial generators, massive wind turbine blades, and even entire diesel locomotives. Its cargo hold offered roughly double the capacity of a Boeing 747. There had only ever been one of these machines built and flying in the entire world, and suddenly, in an instant, there were none left. The global aviation community genuinely mourned the loss as though a person had died, not simply a piece of equipment. But here's the detail that most people following the headlines at the time genuinely had no idea about. A second An-225 airframe had actually been sitting under construction since as far back as 1989. Assembly work on. That second unit actually continued for a while even after the Soviet Union itself fell apart, right up until it was finally paused in 1994, because the aircraft's enormous cargo capacity had suddenly come to be viewed as excessive for the realistic market at the time. There wasn't enough demand out there, there wasn't sufficient funding available, and there wasn't really a compelling reason to finish building a second giant aircraft when the original was already flying successfully. So that unfinished second airframe simply sat in storage, essentially frozen in time for roughly 3 decades. Within only a few weeks of the original aircraft's destruction, Antonov publicly announced that reconstruction efforts were already quietly getting underway. And buried inside that announcement was a detail that genuinely reframed the entire scope of the project. They weren't actually starting the rebuild from absolute zero after all. The burned, wrecked aircraft wasn't a complete write-off in the way most casual observers assumed. In practice, it was functioning as a donor for spare parts. Landing gear assemblies, sections of the tail structure, and certain surviving engine components, essentially anything that had genuinely survived the fire intact, would be carefully removed from the wreckage and installed directly into that second, still unfinished airframe sitting in storage. Picture it this way for a moment. Imagine owning 2 separate cars. One of them has been badly wrecked in an accident, but its engine underneath the hood still runs perfectly fine. The other car remains structurally sound and completely intact, but was simply never finished being built in the first place. So naturally, you strip usable components out of the wrecked vehicle and use them to finally complete the other one. That's essentially the exact plan Antonov settled on here. Except this obviously isn't some ordinary car sitting in a driveway somewhere. It's the single heaviest aircraft ever constructed, and the actual list of components that genuinely still need to be manufactured completely from scratch runs considerably longer than Antonov has publicly acknowledged so far. And that's precisely where the real, deeply complicated problems actually begin. And if this happens to be the first time you've come across this particular channel, this is exactly the kind of content we specialize in here. No unnecessary hype or exaggeration, just the real underlying mechanics behind some of the biggest ongoing stories in aviation today. Go ahead and hit subscribe if that's genuinely the kind of content you're looking for. Now, back to the Maria, because the real genuine obstacles standing in the way of this project haven't even properly begun yet. So Antonov clearly does have an actual plan in place here. Combine 2 separate airframes together into one single completed aircraft. On the surface, that sounds fairly simple and manageable. It genuinely isn't, because the very moment you start asking exactly how much this entire undertaking will actually cost, the numbers stop making any kind of consistent sense whatsoever. The various cost estimates floating around for this particular project are genuinely all over the place, and that inconsistency alone tells you something meaningful on its own. Antonov's own publicly posted figure back in 2022 was $500 million. Ukraine's state-owned defense conglomerate, Ukroboronprom, put the real number considerably higher at over $3 billion instead, and stated the project would realistically require at least 5 full years to complete. That represents roughly a 6-fold difference in cost estimates, coming from within the exact same country, discussing the exact same aircraft. Why does such an enormous gap even exist in the first place? Because, quite simply, nobody actually has a clear, concrete understanding of exactly what they're dealing with yet. One individual who personally toured and inspected that second airframe back in 2016 estimated its completion level was actually closer to only 20%, not the widely circulated 60 to 70% figure that most public reports and outlets tend to reference. After sitting untouched in storage for roughly 30 years, even the genuine subject matter experts involved in this project still can't fully agree on precisely how finished this particular airframe actually is. And the exact completion percentage isn't even the only serious complication sitting here either. This particular airframe was originally designed all the way back in the 1980s, and it relies on 1980s era engineering and technology essentially throughout its entire structure. So Antonov isn't simply completing an already fully designed aircraft in any straightforward, simple sense. The company is actively deciding whether to finish it as a kind of preserved museum artifact straight out of the Cold War era, or instead rebuild it around genuinely modern systems bolted onto a structural airframe that's already more than 4 decades old. Then there's the matter of engines, and this is genuinely where the whole rebuilding effort becomes considerably more complicated. The original AN/TU-25 flew using 6 D18T turbofan engines, a specific engine type that simply isn't produced in any meaningful volume anywhere in the world anymore today. 6 engines, built exclusively and specifically for just one single aircraft type on the entire planet. Each individual newly manufactured replacement engine is currently estimated to cost somewhere around $20 million. 6 engines alone before you've even touched. The actual airframe itself adds up to $120 million just to make the finished aircraft physically capable of leaving the ground under its own power. Now here's the part that genuinely sets this entire project apart from almost anything else happening anywhere across commercial or military aviation today. The AN/TU-25 was originally built during an era when Ukraine and Russia still shared the exact same integrated Soviet industrial supply chain. It was actually developed directly from the earlier Antonov AN-124 Ruslan design, and for decades afterward, components, technical expertise, and even routine maintenance know-how flowed freely back and forth between Ukrainian and Russian aerospace industries with minimal friction. As everyone now knows, that entire working relationship has been completely severed by the war, which means thousands of individual parts and support systems that used to come from suppliers based inside Russia now need to be sourced elsewhere entirely, either rebuilt domestically within Ukraine itself, or procured through brand new international partnerships with companies that never previously worked on this specific aircraft type at all. Antonov has stated that the aircraft still retains meaningful parts commonality with the AN-124 Ruslan, which genuinely helps the overall rebuilding effort, but only for the specific components Ukraine can actually still manufacture or source independently without needing anything from Russia. So who exactly ends up covering the enormous financial cost of all this? Antonov has publicly framed the entire undertaking as a genuinely international project, one specifically involving aviation companies and organizations from multiple different countries working together in coordination. Various proposals from outside organizations have reportedly already been reviewed internally, and funding sourced from several different potential channels is currently being actively considered. No single national government has formally committed any actual funding at this point. No binding contract has yet been officially signed by any party involved. The airline's own chief pilot has publicly stated that Antonov is currently in direct communication with Boeing, Airbus, and Embraer, actively inviting all 3 major aircraft manufacturers to participate in the rebuilding effort in some meaningful capacity. In his own words, a project of this particular magnitude can genuinely only be realized through true international cooperation. Ukroboronprom, meanwhile, has separately made its own position clear regarding exactly who should ultimately be responsible for covering the bill, Russia. The company has explicitly stated that all costs should be fully covered by the Russian Federation, given that it was Russia's invasion that directly caused the aircraft's destruction in the first place. That's fundamentally a legal argument being publicly made here, not an actual concrete funding mechanism, and international legal proceedings, as everyone knows, tend to move at an extraordinarily slow pace. Antonov has consistently declined to provide any kind of firm public completion timetable for the project, stating instead that considerably more preliminary engineering work genuinely needs to happen before any realistic timescale can even be reasonably established. Fuller, more concrete project details, the company says, will only genuinely emerge once the ongoing war has actually come to an end. That particular closing statement carries real weight here. Everything discussed throughout this story so far, the two combined airframes, the merged salvaged components, that widely cited $500 million estimate, all of it still remains, at this current moment, essentially a plan sitting on paper. Assembly work has reportedly begun and currently stands at roughly 30% completion overall. But there's still no officially confirmed final budget in place, no locked-in committed investor secured, and no publicly announced completion date anywhere on the horizon. What genuinely exists right now is clear intent, some meaningful early-stage work already underway, and a very large, still entirely open question surrounding exactly where all the necessary funding is ultimately going to come from. Now let's assume, purely hypothetically, that this entire project actually does succeed in the end. Let's say the necessary funding eventually materializes, all the required components get properly sourced, and Antonov genuinely reaches the point of rolling a completed, finished aircraft directly out of the hangar doors. What would actually appear different about it, from a purely external, visual perspective? Almost nothing at all, as it turns out. Antonov has been genuinely clear publicly that there are currently no plans whatsoever to alter the aircraft's external appearance in any meaningful way. The same 6 engines, the same distinctive twin vertical tail fins, the same enormous wingspan, wider than an entire football field laid end to end. And once it finally does roll out of the hangar for the first time, the colors of the Ukrainian flag that it proudly displayed before its destruction will genuinely be incorporated into its livery once again. The sheer amount of paint alone actually reveals something meaningful about the true physical scale of this particular machine. The original Mriya carried approximately 900 kilograms of paint across its exterior, roughly equivalent to the total weight of a small compact car. It was also actually among the very first large aircraft anywhere in the world to use polyurethane-based paint, a specialized coating engineered specifically to remain glossy and resistant to UV radiation, rainfall, and humidity. Over many years of continuous outdoor exposure to the elements, that distinctive exterior finish is genuinely part of the aircraft's iconic silhouette, and that silhouette itself represents a meaningful part of exactly why this entire rebuilding project feels genuinely worthwhile to so many people watching it unfold. But step inside the aircraft itself and you'd genuinely be looking at a fundamentally different airplane on the inside. The interior would reportedly be outfitted with fully modern equipment throughout, which in practical terms means completely stripping out the original 1980s era analog instrumentation and replacing it entirely with the kind of fully digital glass cockpit you'd typically find aboard a genuinely modern wide-body commercial aircraft flying today. Updated avionics systems, modern satellite-based navigation, digital systems, monitoring, replacing the old-fashioned mechanical dials and analog gauges that once filled the cockpit. Think of it a bit like fully restoring a classic vintage car, but completely replacing the entire engine bay and dashboard with components pulled from a car manufactured 40 full years later, all while carefully preserving the original exterior body panels completely untouched. The distinctive external shape that made the aircraft famous stays exactly the same. Everything beneath the surface that actually makes it functional gets completely rebuilt around modern 21st century engineering standards instead. And there's genuinely one more fascinating dimension layered on top of all of this. The finished aircraft would essentially end up being assembled from 3 genuinely distinct technological eras all at once, combined within a single unified airframe. A structural design dating back to the 1980s, salvaged, surviving components pulled directly from an aircraft that actually flew commercial missions right up until its destruction in 2022, and brand new modern systems freshly installed throughout the current rebuilding process itself. No other aircraft anywhere currently flying in the entire world would carry that particular kind of layered, multi-era timeline stitched together into one single physical airframe. But before addressing anything further, there's a genuinely difficult question that nobody involved in the official public announcements seems particularly eager to answer directly. Let's start honestly by addressing the underlying commercial case for this entire project. The AN-225 was genuinely never actually designed to function as some kind of generic, everyday heavy-lift freighter aircraft in the first place. Operating the original aircraft cost approximately $32,000 per flight hour. That works out to roughly 4 times what an equivalent Boeing 747 freighter typically costs to operate on a per-hour basis. You simply don't charter a highly specialized machine like that unless you genuinely have absolutely no other realistic alternative available to you. which means the actual pool of missions that ever genuinely justified using the AN-225 in practice was always relatively small to begin with, even throughout its most successful operational years. Now factor in the broader, genuinely difficult economic reality Ukraine as a nation currently finds itself operating under. The country's GDP contracted by nearly 30% during 2022 alone. Direct, well-documented war damage across the nation has reportedly reached approximately $152 billion total. Estimated reconstruction costs across the entire country over the coming decade have been projected at roughly $486 billion. A nation actively working to rebuild destroyed hospitals and damaged electrical power grids simply doesn't have $3 billion sitting comfortably to one side available to pour into a single-purpose specialty cargo aircraft. Independent EU-based economic research has projected that Ukraine's overall economy likely won't fully return to pre-war levels until sometime around 2030. And yet, remarkably, Antonov continues pursuing this particular project anyway, at least in part. The genuinely honest way to frame all of this is really this. There are roughly 44 million people currently living in Ukraine. For a substantial portion of them, the Maria was never simply viewed as just another cargo aircraft sitting on a runway somewhere in the world. It was living, tangible proof that Ukrainian engineers were fully capable of building something the rest of the entire world had genuinely never seen before. Losing it felt deeply personal to an enormous number of people throughout the country. Rebuilding it now carries that exact same emotional significance in return. Looking purely through the lens of a cold investment spreadsheet, there's genuinely no strong financial argument in favor of rebuilding the AN-225 at all. But looking through virtually every other lens Ukraine currently finds itself operating through as a nation right now, there's genuinely no strong argument against attempting it either. Both of those two statements happen to be simultaneously true at the exact same time. And that underlying tension is really exactly why this project keeps quietly inching forward piece by piece, even while the necessary funding still genuinely isn't fully secured yet. That's really the AN-225 story as things currently stand right now today. But if you're genuinely interested in understanding the much bigger picture surrounding everything currently happening to Antonov as a company overall, we've actually already covered that topic in a separate dedicated video. The An-124 Ruslan, the massive military transport aircraft that shares essentially the same underlying engineering DNA as the Maria, built during that exact same era by many of the very same engineers, and now facing that exact same brutal supply chain crisis as a direct consequence of the ongoing war. And just like the story of the An-225 itself, genuinely nobody expected what actually ended up happening with that particular aircraft program either. That video is linked directly here. Go ahead and give it a watch next. And if this is genuinely the kind of in-depth, no-nonsense analysis you're looking for, no unnecessary hype, just the real underlying mechanics behind these ongoing stories, go ahead and subscribe. We'll see you in the very next one. It's genuinely worth stepping back for a moment to consider just how unusual this entire situation actually is within the broader history of commercial and military aviation as a whole. Aircraft get damaged and subsequently repaired fairly routinely throughout the industry. Airlines regularly rebuild aircraft following ground collisions, hard landings, or onboard mechanical fires, drawing heavily on established supply chains and readily available spare parts inventories to get a damaged airframe back into service within a matter of months rather than years. What genuinely makes the Maria's particular situation so unprecedented is the near total absence of any of those normal supporting infrastructure elements. There's simply no active production line still running anywhere in the world for this specific aircraft type. There's no large surviving fleet of sister aircraft available to cannibalize spare parts from. Given that there was only ever one flying example in existence at any given time, there's no manufacturer parts catalog anywhere listing readily available replacement components for purchase. Essentially, every single part that can't be salvaged from the original wreckage or pulled directly from that second unfinished airframe has to be reverse engineered from scratch, redesigned entirely, or manufactured completely new, using whatever original engineering documentation Antonov's team can still actually locate and access today, decades after the original design work was completed. That underlying reality also helps explain precisely why Antonov keeps deliberately framing this entire project in explicitly international terms, rather than presenting it as a purely domestic Ukrainian engineering undertaking. Modern aircraft manufacturing, even for a fundamentally structural design that's genuinely 4 decades old at its core, depends enormously on specialized suppliers, spread out across dozens of different countries worldwide, covering everything from specialty metal alloys and advanced composite materials to precision avionics systems and certified electrical components, rebuilding an aircraft. This singular and genuinely unique essentially means reconstructing a small piece of that entire global supply web completely from scratch, one supplier relationship at a time, all while simultaneously navigating around a live, ongoing war that has already destroyed significant portions of Ukraine's own domestic manufacturing infrastructure. Whether Boeing, Airbus, or Embraer ultimately end up playing any genuinely meaningful role in this particular effort remains entirely unclear at this point in time. But the simple fact that Antonov is already having these direct conversations at all tells you something genuinely important about just how far outside any conventional aircraft restoration project this particular rebuilding effort actually sits within the broader aviation world. There's also something worth considering about the sheer symbolic timing of this whole effort continuing to move forward, even amid an active, ongoing war. Most large industrial reconstruction projects of this scale and complexity typically wait until a conflict has fully ended before beginning serious work, simply because the risks of continued disruption remain too high otherwise. Antonov choosing to move forward, regardless, even incrementally, even without a fully secured budget in place, sends its own quiet message about the country's broader determination to preserve its engineering identity and industrial heritage throughout an incredibly difficult period. Whether that message ultimately translates into a fully completed flying aircraft remains to be seen, but the mere act of continuing forward, piece by piece, component by component, already represents something genuinely meaningful in its own right to the people directly involved in this remarkable ongoing effort.